Hello, I am Khalik James with the American Insight Free Speech Team, and I'd like to welcome you to our Speakeasy Salon for the month of May. American Insight's mission is to promote insight into the history and values of free speech, human rights, and the rule of law, and to empower students to use their voice to discuss how these values emerge in societies around the world through the lens of independent filmmakers. I'd like to welcome our special guest for this month, Kermit Roosevelt III, and his student, Natasha Pereira. Kermit is a professor of constitutional law at the University of Pennsylvania, an award-winning author of fiction and nonfiction books, and a legal scholar. He is also a keynote speaker, adept at discussing everything from the Supreme Court, civil rights, U.S. presidential history and American politics, to leadership, patriotism, and U.S. current events. We hope that you will enter your questions into the Q&A panel, and I will be back later to share them with our guests. Kermit and Natasha, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Hello, everybody. My name is Natasha Pereira. I'm a high school student from New York, and I love American history, and I've worked with Professor Roosevelt over the past year.
And as you heard, I'm Kermit Roosevelt. I teach constitutional law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. And I'm very happy to be here. Thanks to American Insight for hosting us.
So today we're going to be talking a little bit about Professor Roosevelt's recent book, The Nation That Never Was. Professor, to start off, would you mind giving a brief overview of your book?
Yeah, so I think maybe the best way to understand the book is as my attempt to solve a problem that I think is facing America today. So it's interesting that you said you love American history, because I feel like loving American history and loving America can be two different things, in that the more we learn about American history, sometimes the harder it is to love America. And that's the problem that I'm thinking about. And one way of describing it is maybe to say our national story isn't working anymore. So we have this national story, this idea of who we are as a country, who our heroes are, what our values are, and where they come from. And basically this story is focused on 1776. So we talk about the Declaration of Independence, the Revolution, and then the Constitution in 1787, a little bit later. But it's the founding fathers, and that's the historical moment that we're supposed to tie our identity to. And so for quite a while, not forever, because the history of how this story emerges is actually really interesting, but for quite a while we've been tying our identity to this moment in 1776. And we said the Declaration is the source of our ideals, the founding fathers are our heroes, but it turns out if you look more closely at some of that, it looks less good. So every state recognizes slavery in 1776. Thomas Jefferson enslaved his own children. So what I'm seeing happening now, and I see this actually a fair amount with my students, is that progressives today, and particularly younger progressives, aren't connecting with this story. And they think that means that they're not connecting with America. So they say, look at the America of 1776. Every state recognizes slavery, like I said. In the Declaration, the patriots complain about the British freeing the people that they enslave. They demand compensation for that for decades. This is a big thing in American foreign policy. They go on and write a constitution that protects slavery. And people are saying, you know, those are not my heroes. I have a hard time seeing myself in that historical moment. I don't believe in that America. And my point is, there's a different story. There's a different America. And it's actually worthy of our faith. So this is a story that centers the Civil War and Reconstruction instead of the founding and the Revolution. And I'm saying we can understand the relationship between those two moments differently than people do. We can understand the Civil War and Reconstruction as really a revolution that destroyed founding America. It destroyed the nation that our young people can't identify with, and it made one that they can. So I'm trying to show people that America. And I've been trying to come up with sort of a slogan for this. And the best one I have so far is America is a better nation than you think because it's a different nation than you think.
Interesting. Okay. So then in modern history, why does the standard story that we know of fail us when we look at events like the Jan 6th insurrection in particular?
Well, so one of the things about the standard story, you know, and we sort of just accept this, but it seems like a very strange thing to accept, is that it tells you American patriotism is treason against the national government in defense of your view of your rights. So you think the national government is infringing on your rights, they're engaged in some conspiracy to take away your liberty, then you fight them, even though it's technically treason, because that's what the revolution is under British law. And you've got these paramilitary organizations like the Sons of Liberty and the Minutemen. They're mostly white paramilitaries. They're fighting the national government. Those are supposed to be our heroes, even if what they're doing is technically insurrection or treason. So translate that to January 6th. What's happening? There are white paramilitaries fighting the national government. What they're doing is technically insurrection or treason, but they're saying, hey, look, we're the good guys. And they're out there, of course, with their Revolutionary War flags, you know, the Gadsden flag, the Appeal to Heaven flag. They've got all of this revolutionary iconography because that's the story that they're telling. And if we're telling the same story, it makes it a lot harder for us to say those are the bad guys, right? Treason against the national government is a bad thing. But we do actually want to say that, I think, and January 6th is sort of one crystallization of that. The Civil War and Reconstruction and the aftermath of Reconstruction is another.
Okay, so essentially, in a way, the Constitution supports the Jan 6 insurrectionists in the same way that it supports the South in the Civil War. Would that be
well, so I think
correct?
the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are different there. So I don't think I would say that the Constitution supports the insurrectionists. I mean, the Constitution is actually what, in response to an insurrection, in response to the Southern secession and the Civil War, says, for instance, if you participated in this insurrection, you can't hold office anymore. So the Constitution, before the Civil War, I do think there's an argument that it sort of supports the South. I don't think that secession is legal necessarily under the Constitution, and this is something I've talked to Akil Amar about, and he's changed my thinking. But the general vision of the 1787 Constitution is the national government is the threat to liberty. The national government is where the danger is going to come from. The states are the good guys. The states protect the liberty and the rights of their citizens. And of course, they're thinking that because enslaved people aren't citizens. So if you think the states are the good guys, you can say that if you take enslaved people and women out of the picture, which the founding pretty much does. So the general vision of the Constitution kind of does support the South. The Declaration of Independence, I think, very clearly supports the South in the Civil War because they're declaring their independence. They're doing exactly what the Founding Fathers did, and they say this, too, the Southern states. When they write letters to Congress, when their representatives withdraw, when they give their statement of causes that justify their withdrawal from the Union, they say we are doing what the Founding Fathers did in 1776. And I think they're right on that. And then, again, the Declaration supports the January 6th insurrectionists, too.
Okay, so then basically we are a kind of birth of a new nation. We have different democratic ideals today than America did in the 1800s. So then who have been the major figures in American history in correcting those democratic ideals?
So I think you can find people who do espouse our modern values, our values of liberty and equality, from very early. The argument that I make in the book is you don't really find those in the Declaration of Independence as it's understood in 1776. And a really clear illustration of this is Benjamin Banneker. So Benjamin Banneker is a black astronomer, writes a letter to Thomas Jefferson saying, hey, you said all men are created equal. Don't you think that's inconsistent with slavery? So my argument is the way it was understood in 1776, it's actually not inconsistent with slavery. And that's kind of a complicated technical argument that I make in the book, but historically, it's actually pretty well supported, right? Some people thought this is a principle that condemns slavery. Most people didn't think that. And when Banneker writes to Jefferson, Jefferson answers him, but completely ignores what he says about all men are created equal and slavery. So there's a moment, I think, where you can ask, which of these men is one of our founding fathers? And the answer is, it's more Benjamin Banneker than Thomas Jefferson. So there are abolitionists primarily who have this ideal in early America. And then when does it sort of enter our Constitution? When does it become part of our higher law? When does the idea of democracy really come? Another thing about the Declaration of Independence is it's not pro-democracy. So again, You have to sort of read it carefully to see this, but the Declaration tells you what makes a government legitimate. And it's protection of the natural rights of the people who form it and consent of the governed. And both of those things you can have with a monarchy. It's not until the Civil War and maybe the Gettysburg Address, where Lincoln talks about government of the people, by the people, for the people, that we get this articulation of democracy as an ideal. And then it's not until Reconstruction that you really get democratic values put in the Constitution. So the founding Constitution has the potential for democracy. It's sort of as democratic as the states want it to be. But it's not until Reconstruction that you get our higher law and the federal government and the national constitution imposing a requirement of democracy on the states.
Got it. Okay. So then would you say Abraham Lincoln is the true American hero?
Yeah, if you're going to identify one person as the father of the country, my whole move is I want to shift our story from the founding to the Civil War and Reconstruction. And it works kind of beautifully, I think. So the standard story says, we've got this short document that states our ideals. It's the Declaration of Independence. And I say, well, no, we've got a short document that states our ideals, but it's the Gettysburg Address. And the standard story says, and then we fight a war for those ideals. It's the Revolution. And I say, no, we fight a war for those ideals, but it's the Civil War. And the standard story says, and then we have a longer document that makes these ideals into law. It's the 1787 Constitution. And I say, no, we've got a longer document that makes these ideals into law. It's the Reconstruction Constitution. And you can do the same thing with who are our heroes, who's the father of our country. So if you want to identify one person, the standard story says George Washington is the father of our country. And I'm saying, no, it's Abraham Lincoln, right? You want like the first president of modern America. That's Abraham Lincoln.
Okay. So then there's a certain historical viewpoint that Lincoln ordered immediate emancipation of all slaves in the Civil War for military strategy and that it would help the North win the war. So how do you respond to that argument?
Well, so I think there are two things to understand there. One is Lincoln was an abolitionist, right? Lincoln wanted the end of slavery. But Lincoln was working within a constitutional system that didn't give him the power to do that. So it was pretty clear. It was a pretty widely shared consensus. Again, there are always outliers. There are always people who have sort of crazy idiosyncratic constitutional theories. But it was a pretty widely shared consensus. And, you know, to the extent that there's such a thing as constitutional truth, I think it's true that the federal government didn't have the power to abolish slavery under the Constitution that was written in 1787. So how is abolition going to happen? Well, maybe a constitutional amendment. But if you think about that, it's very hard to amend the Constitution. You need ratification by 3/4 of the states. And you've got 13 slave states. So how long would it take, you know, if you look at American history, to get enough states, enough free states to abolish slavery? It never happens. Right? The number of slave states that existed in 1861 could block a constitutional amendment now. So what does that show us? It shows us, I think, that you don't end slavery without breaking the constitutional order of founding America. And so it's sort of not surprising, it's sort of poetic, really, that Lincoln has to do it in the middle of a war as a military measure because the constitutional system that he's working in doesn't allow him to do it any other way. And then we later see in Reconstruction, with the Reconstruction Amendments, that constitutional order getting broken more explicitly.
Okay, so then if we're saying that we're looking towards Reconstruction and the Gettysburg Address as like the real founding of America that we see today, then if thinking about American history, when would you say American history begins? Because that's also a pretty controversial topic.
Right. So that's something that people argue about, you know, and for a long time we would say it starts in 1776 and then the 1619 project comes and says, no, it's 1619. And I sometimes think of my book as like the 1863 project. So like 1776 is picked because that's the Declaration of Independence. My counterpart to the Declaration of Independence is the Gettysburg Address. I think it states these values of liberty, equality, democracy which the Declaration really doesn't have. So that's 1863. 1863 is also the Emancipation Proclamation. It's sort of a turning point in the Civil War when what started out as more of a war for union becomes a war to end slavery. It becomes a war for freedom. And that, I think, is also what makes America the nation that we are today. So I would say the history of our nation really starts in 1863.
Okay, so then another, I guess, argument to that would be that we see Reconstruction as mostly like a failed process in American history, and that it led to many, many decades of segregation and Jim Crow laws. So then how can we say that the Gettysburg Address was the document that we should be looking to if we know what comes after it?
Well, so this is another interesting way, I think, in which my story parallels the standard story, but is better. So the standard story says, hey, look, we've got this great statement of our ideals, the Declaration of Independence in 1776. But we have to admit that slavery existed in 1776, right? And that was a bad thing, and it's inconsistent with the ideals we want to say were there in the Declaration. And slavery goes on for another 90 years, basically. And that's bad, and we have to sort of explain it somehow, and we take a lesson from it, and we say slavery was our original sin. And what does that tell you if you're trying to be a good American? I guess it means don't enslave people, which is a good point, but not enough. Because don't enslave people says to be a good American, you as an individual should not do bad things, right? And if you're not doing bad things as an individual, like if you're not an active individual racist, then you're okay, and you're doing what America asks of you. And maybe, this is like the really insidious part of it, maybe you can enslave people, right? Maybe you can enslave your own children, like Thomas Jefferson did, and still be an American hero if you say the right things, if you write beautiful phrases about equality, right? So I think that's a bad lesson. What does my story say? My story says, look, we've got the Gettysburg Address, we've got the Reconstruction Amendments, and we really do state these ideals of liberty, equality, democracy. We really do put them in the Constitution, but then we don't live up to them. We don't defend them against the white supremacist paramilitaries who try to overthrow the Reconstruction governments and do succeed in overthrowing our first multiracial democracy, the integrated Reconstruction governments of the South. They succeed because Americans stand by and let it happen. Because white Americans prioritize unity, and unity among white Americans, over justice. And that's the original sin in my story. It's the redemption, what they call the redemption of the South, the overthrow of those Reconstruction governments. And the bad thing that Americans do that we need to learn from is not actively enslaving people, it's passively standing by and letting that happen. And so to be a good American, in my story, look around at the world, see if injustice is happening, and if there is injustice, it's your duty to oppose it. So you're not a good American just from refraining from actively doing bad things. You actually have to actively go out and do good things.
Okay, that's an interesting reframing of how we look at today's world. But just one more question about Lincoln. So Lincoln died in 1865, and he wasn't able to carry his plan of Reconstruction through. So how do you think America would be different today if he had been alive during Reconstruction?
Well, that's a super interesting question that people ask a lot. And honestly, counterfactual history is just sort of impossible to do. But my take on it, which I guess is not quite the take that most people have, or at least not immediately, is if Lincoln had lived, Reconstruction would have been less radical, I think. Because Lincoln was not as radical as the radical Republicans in Congress. But he was the leader of the Republican Party. So I think he would have gotten his way, probably, and it would have been less extreme. It would have gone less far towards equality than the radical Republicans ended up going. So when Lincoln is assassinated, you get Andrew Johnson, right? And then you get intense conflict between the president and Congress. And you get public opinion turning against the South because of the assassination of Lincoln. So I think Reconstruction actually ends up going farther because of Lincoln's assassination than it would have otherwise.
That's interesting. So to bring it a little bit back to modern history, The Color of Law right now is a pretty popular and controversial book. And the author's thesis is that the government perpetuated modern segregation in the 1950s with housing discrimination and redlining. So do you believe in his thesis that the government has created what we see today as modern segregation?
Yeah, so I think that's a great book. I mention it, I rely on it. Um, and yeah, so if you look at Supreme Court cases, and I think this is the view that is sort of filtered out into American society more broadly, they make this very sharp distinction between de jure segregation, where it's required by law and the government has done it, and de facto segregation, where it's just the product of private choice. And there can't really be anything wrong with that because it's just how people choose freely to organize their lives and who they want to be with, and you've got rights of freedom of association and so on. And I guess maybe the court needs to work with those two categories because the court needs sharp lines. The court needs to say, this gets treated this way under our law and this gets treated another way. And it just needs clear distinctions and it needs to simplify things. But the point that The Color of Law is making, and I think it's right, and it's an insight that legal scholars have developed more in other contexts too, is you can't draw this bright line between what the government does and what private individuals do, because most of the time there's a lot more blending of those categories than people understand. And what looks like private choice in housing patterns and neighborhood construction often is incentivized by the government, and sometimes it's enforced by the government in subtle ways. So the way that American society is now in terms of segregation and also in terms of like household wealth inequality has a lot to do with what the government has done. You can't say, oh, it's not the government's fault, it's just happening in the private realm.
Got it. Okay. So then, so that book says that de jure segregation was characterizing the 1950s, 1960s. But today, are we still seeing de jure segregation in government legislation, or is it mostly now just a product of what happened in the 1950s and 60s?
Well, so I don't think that there's as much overt racial segregation or discrimination going on. I mean, if you go back to the 1950s, you can see it on the face of a lot of statutes, and you can see the practices, you can see overt racial segregation. One thing that we're dealing with is the overhang of that. So you've got a legacy of discrimination. But you also have a system, I think, that builds up discrimination in ways that aren't overt and don't rely on facial classifications. But once you have a sort of racially stratified society, race neutrality actually helps preserve that in lots of ways. So if you have a society with pervasive inequality, and if you have a society with racially segregated neighborhoods, it's not 100%, but it's largely racially segregated, then if you put down race neutral rules on top of that, and you just draw your school attendance zones around these neighborhoods, and in particular, if, as the current Supreme Court is doing, you start saying the government can't take race into consideration at all, what you do is sort of lock that inequality into place, because it's race conscious measures that are going to ameliorate it.
Got it. Okay, so then what actions can the federal government take to reverse some of the racial inequality we see today?
Well, so there's a book called When Affirmative Action Was White, and there's a book called The Color of Money. There are a bunch of really good books on this that look at federal spending over the years. And it's sort of like The Color of Law, in that if you look back at American history, what you see is there's massive federal spending, right? And it basically creates the middle class. Through the 20th century, the federal government is spending lots of money, bringing Americans up out of poverty, creating our middle class through things like Social Security and the GI Bill and support for housing, mortgages. And if you look at those programs, most of them actually have a racial tilt. So the Social Security program excludes occupations that are disproportionately held by blacks. And lots of black veterans don't get the benefits of the GI Bill, and there's redlining with respect to the mortgages and so on, like you mentioned. So we've got these really big spending programs that have a racial angle to them that excludes minorities. And what I say in the book is, look, so we've shown we know how to do race-conscious spending, right? We know how to direct federal spending in a way that has racially disproportionate effects. And maybe it would be good, I mean, I think, yes, it would be good, if we just changed the direction of that. So if we engaged in some federal spending that was designed to reduce racial inequality rather than increase it, which is what we've been doing, we don't have to call it reparations. We don't have to make it race conscious on its face. We just have to identify programs that will reduce the racial wealth gap. And there are a lot of interventions out there that public policy organizations and think tanks have come up with. Minimum wage, housing support, neighborhood economic zones. There's a whole bunch of things that people have come up with that we could do very easily. And they would be clearly constitutional. It's just a question of political will.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it also, I guess, ties into this whole environmental justice debate where certain neighborhoods are much more exposed to toxic chemicals and like corporation fuels and exhaust and all of that, like Asthma Alley in New York. So yeah, the federal government should just take more of a role with that. Interesting. Okay, so then how does your new story help us address some of the other modern issues like reproductive rights and gun control, and how does it kind of help in the Senate right now?
In the Senate? Well, so those are really complicated issues with a bunch of different moving parts, and gun control I think is super interesting because on the one hand, I'm like, the Second Amendment is about state militias fighting off the national army, right? So it's not an individual right. But then you get to Reconstruction, and actually when Congress is talking about the right to bear arms, and they do talk about it with the 14th Amendment, they're talking about formerly enslaved people defending themselves against private violence when the states won't defend them. And actually there it is an individual right related to self-defense, which doesn't mean that all regulations are unconstitutional. Like what the Supreme Court has done with the right to bear arms is, I think, indefensible as a matter of constitutional interpretation. But going maybe to the Senate, well, a couple things. So one is if you shift the story the way that I do, I think you have this idea of equality in a way that you don't with the founding. And I think that does actually help make arguments for reproductive rights, because I think of reproductive rights as an issue of equality primarily. But the Senate, so it's interesting that you mentioned the Senate. What I think is happening in American society now, kind of, is there's a struggle going on between the ideology of 1776, which I think is what I call exclusive individualism. So it's focused on individuals, and it's like there are Americans and then there are these others, and the others are different and dangerous, and we should keep them out, and we shouldn't give them the things that really belong to the real Americans. That's sort of the ideology of 1776. And it's fighting with the ideology of Reconstruction, which I call inclusive equality, where the idea is outsiders can become insiders and everyone should be equal. The government can act to promote equality. So tension between these two ideologies. And one of the things we're seeing is that like the architecture, the constitutional architecture set up in 1787 is supporting the values of 1787. Didn't necessarily have to be that way, but that's how it's worked out. Because we have Reconstruction, we changed the Constitution dramatically, we put these new values in the 14th Amendment, but we don't change the basic structure of government set up by the founders. And one of the things that they set up is equal state suffrage in the Senate. So each state gets 2 votes regardless of its size. The Dakotas count for as much as California and New York, which I think is crazy, but they do. And that means that a minority, senators representing a small minority of the American population, can control the Senate, and then the filibuster makes it even worse. And recently, and this didn't happen for a long time, but recently the small state tilt of the Senate has taken on a partisan valence, because the small state tilt tends to be a rural tilt, and the rural tilt tends to be a white tilt. So now you've got the white rural population being empowered, and there really is an urban-rural split in American politics now. So it's turned out, and it's just sort of a coincidence, I think mostly, but it's turned out that the structure of government created in 1787 is supporting the values of 1776, which I'm saying are not very good values, against the values of 1863 or 1868. And thinking about it that way maybe suggests we shouldn't feel imprisoned, or we should try not to be imprisoned by the structural provisions that the Constitution set up in 1787. The solution for this is admit small blue states so that the small state tilt isn't partisan anymore, like admit the District of Columbia. That would help a lot.
Okay, so then going off of that, so currently people think that the Supreme Court doesn't represent them accurately because it's been conservative for much of its history. So does your news story address some of the issues with the Supreme Court?
Well, so what does it say about the Supreme Court? I'm not sure what it says about the Supreme Court, really. I think if you look at American history, you see two things, really. One is the Supreme Court is not typically an engine of progress, because Supreme Court justices, no matter who's appointing them, tend to be drawn from the legal elite. So you get sort of an elite view of American values, which is historically usually not the progressive view. So the Supreme Court, one, it's drawn from a pretty elite stratum of society. Two, it tends to lag political change. So the Supreme Court tends to be conservative with a small c, in that turnover on the court is usually slower than turnover in the other branches of government. If you imagine, like, day one, there's a presidential election, and then day two, a new political ideology sweeps America. How quickly can that ideology take over and get expressed through the federal government? Well, they get the House of Representatives in 2 years, because every member is up for election in 2 years. They get the Senate in 4 years, because the senators are staggered, with 1/3 being elected every 2 years. They get the presidency in 4 years, because that's how long it takes for the next election. When did they get the Supreme Court? No one knows, because there aren't regular Supreme Court appointments. But it will almost certainly be longer than 4 years. So the Supreme Court tends to lag behind the other political branches. But then what we've seen most recently is the Supreme Court is also subject to minoritarian capture, again because of the structural provisions of the 1787 Constitution. So you can have a president who loses the popular vote but wins because of the Electoral College, part of the 1787 Constitution strongly tied to slavery. And you can have senators who represent a minority of the American people, and again, that's just the small state bias, and the popular vote losing president nominates Supreme Court justices, and the minority representing senators confirm them, and now the Supreme Court has been captured by a minority. And of course, that's exactly what has happened. And that's why we have a 6-3 Republican tilt on the Supreme Court, even though the Republicans have won the popular vote once in the last, 7 or 8 elections.
All right. Thank you so much for this discussion, Professor Roosevelt. I will turn it now over to Khalik.
All right. Thank you both for that discussion and for that wonderful narrative and all the information about your book. Really appreciate it. Now we do have time for questions from our audience. To our attendees, if you have questions, please use the Q&A panel. You'll find that at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can click there and enter a question for Professor Roosevelt to answer. And please feel free to do that now. I'm looking here at the Q&A panel, and I do have a question that's already come in. So this question is from Jennifer Beacom. It says, "Good morning, Professor. Thank you for your time this morning. As a Roosevelt with that accompanying legacy, Do you feel a special urgency to get this message out to our young people? And do you think President Theodore would agree with your thesis?
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the question. I do feel a sense of urgency to get this out to our young people. I mean, I think probably I feel that more because of my experiences as a professor, because I sort of see the generations of students coming through, and I teach constitutional law. And part of teaching constitutional law, I think, really is trying to present the Constitution as a good thing and present the Supreme Court as a guardian of our ideals. And it's, personally quite painful for me to have to say, well, actually, the Supreme Court is striking down the Voting Rights Act, and the Supreme Court is allowing states to engage in racial voter suppression again. And, Congress tried to stop this during the Civil Rights era and the Second Reconstruction, and now the Supreme Court is coming in and undoing the gains of those social movements. Because, like, as a constitutional law professor, we sort of want to look up to the Supreme Court. Do I think that Theodore Roosevelt would agree with this? I do, in a couple of ways. I mean, so one, Theodore Roosevelt is, I think, an interesting historical figure because he is a Republican, but he's still like a party of Lincoln Republican, I would say. And then right by the time you get to FDR, the Roosevelts have become Democrats because of this sort of party realignment. So they shift, I think, at about the right moment when the value of equality kind of moves from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. But Theodore Roosevelt also had conflicts with the Supreme Court, which are in some ways a forerunner of FDR's clashes with the Supreme Court over the New Deal. But Theodore Roosevelt strongly believed that ultimately the defense and the success of American values have to come from the people themselves. So the Supreme Court can help protect the democratic process. I think that's an important role for it. But the Supreme Court isn't necessarily supposed to be telling us what our values are or articulating who we are as a nation. That's really up to we the people, as the Constitution says. So I've been thinking a lot about the Supreme Court and the relationship between the Supreme Court and popular will. And what I was just saying to Natasha was, I think in part, problems with the Supreme Court come from the way other parts of the Constitution allow a minority to control the federal government, but they also come in large part from the way that the Supreme Court is staffed. That we have this irregular, unpredictable process of vacancies open up when someone unexpectedly dies, or vacancies open up when a justice decides it's time to retire so that a president they like can appoint their replacement. And what this means is the Supreme Court can get out of step with the national popular will, which I think is a bad thing, because, right, I believe America really is a democracy, and I believe we the people should be in control. And the way that that happens with the Supreme Court is popular movements elect presidents, and then the presidents share that constitutional vision, and they appoint justices with that constitutional vision. That keeps the Supreme Court in line with national popular sentiment to some degree, if you've got regular appointments. But if you don't, the Supreme Court can be an outlier for a while. And one way that you can sort of measure this is how far is the composition of the Supreme Court off from what it would have been if each president appointed 2 justices per 4-year term. And I had a research assistant calculate this recently. They went back all the way to like 1793, starting then, and they found historical moments where the Supreme Court was on track with that, like we're where we would be if each president appointed 2 justices, or we're off from it. Right now, we're off as far as we've ever been. We're 6 justices off. And that happened in like 1978 was the last time. And then before that, it happened in 1857. So that's the Supreme Court that gave us Dred Scott, a Supreme Court that's as far off our public opinion as the current court. So it doesn't surprise me that we're getting decisions that are sort of shocking to people, like the Dobbs decision, the Bruen decision. This Supreme Court is very extreme, and it's reflecting the views of a minority. And the solution to that, I think, is term limits. So This is something I've been working on a lot in various different capacities with various different organizations. I was a member of the President Biden's Supreme Court Reform Commission. But we can do it by statute, I think. That's a different question. It's sort of complicated, but it doesn't require a constitutional amendment. We could enact a statute that will effectively say every justice has 18 years of active service, and then that they're sort of retired after that. And each president gets to appoint 2 justices per 4-year term. That's going to bring the Supreme Court slowly, right? Not immediately, because it's okay for it to lag, but it's going to bring it slowly and consistently in line with the national popular will. And I think that's going to solve a lot of our problems.
Thank you for that. Okay, I have a couple other questions that have come in. So we have this next question from Kelly. Thank you, Professor Roosevelt, for your insight. American Insight's mission is based on free speech, human rights, and the rule of law. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how those values can be improved in our modern world.
Well, so that's a great question, too. One of the interesting things about free speech, human rights, and the rule of law, I think, is that different people have very different understandings of what threatens those values. So I've been talking to a lot of people about like the free speech crisis in America, but it turns out that different people have very different ideas of what the free speech crisis is. And some people think that it's students are afraid to voice unpopular opinions in class. And some people think it's that professors are investigated and sometimes punished for things that they say. And some people think it's that there's a law in Florida that bans my book. So I'm sort of partial to that one. So there are also like government attempts out there to control what is and is not said, particularly in the public schools, but they're actually trying to reach out to private universities too. And they're saying things like American history must be presented as the development of a nation based on the universal ideals of the Declaration of Independence, which is the law that bans my book. And they're saying you can't present information that makes people feel uncomfortable or guilty on account of their race, which, you know, is vague enough that the teachers don't really know what it is. But then, you know, if parents complain, if they teach about slavery and the white students are like, I feel guilty because of this, you're making me feel bad. So, you know, teachers just don't teach that. There are effectively government attempts to control the way that American history is presented to students and say it like that. And I'm sort of like, well, of course the government has to do that, but they're doing it in a bad way, right? So they're doing it in a way that prevents the accurate teaching of American history. So which of those is the greatest threat to free speech? Well, I think it's unfortunate if students don't feel free to voice unpopular opinions in class, if those are like legitimate, reasonable opinions. And I find in my constitutional law class, sometimes I have to make the conservative arguments because there aren't students who are willing to do it in class, you know, and I do that. And I'm like, here's an opinion, you probably disagree with it. Here's the best defense of it that I can give you. Your task is to come up with an argument that beats the argument I'm giving you. And I think that definitely should happen in class. But there is also like such a thing as norms of civility and norms of offensiveness. And one of the ways that we police those norms is we impose social sanctions on people who say mean and hurtful and offensive things. And, you know, as the boundary of what's considered mean and hurtful and offensive shifts, some people suddenly find themselves on a side they didn't expect to be of that boundary. But I kind of believe that society is moving in a good direction. So I'm not as worried about that. Then like in terms of professors facing sanctions for their speech, again, hits close to home for me. Like I believe in academic freedom. I believe in the free speech rights of professors. If you look at what's being complained about, a lot of it I think doesn't actually fall within the boundaries of academic freedom. Or when it does, it's more professors being targeted by the government for saying politically unpopular things rather than, you know, students heckling a professor who's speaking. Like that's, you know, speech on both sides. I think there there are concerns about shouting down speakers. I'm not a fan of that, but I am much less concerned about students engaging in counter speech than I am concerned about the government prescribing what can and can't be said.
Okay, still questions coming in. So here is one from Neil. Given the current conflict between the original founding document and the Reconstruction document, structural biases built into our system, are you optimistic that the Reconstruction values will ultimately win? If yes, why?
Well, I am optimistic, in part because I choose to be. Because what else are you going to do? I mean, I could say that the deck is stacked against us and we'll never win, but then, like, where do you go with that? And like, I teach students, and at the end of every year, I have to come up with some inspirational closing for them. And for the first 15 or 18 years that I taught constitutional law, I was like, our Constitution is great and it's served us well for over 200 years, and your responsibility is to take care of it. And then I sort of shifted into like, the Constitution responds to social movements, which I think it does. And so you will go out there, and the way that you treat your fellow citizens shapes the meaning of the Constitution, which is also true. And then, like, the past 2 or 3 years, I've said, you might feel that justice is impossible within the system and that you have to break it and make something new. But if you feel that, understand that is an American impulse, and that is not a rejection of America. That is the most deeply American thing you can do, because that's what we do in American history. We take the system as far as we can go with it, and then if it doesn't take us where we need to go, we break it and we make a new one. And that's the Revolution in 1776, and that's the replacement of the Articles of Confederation by the Constitution, and that's the Civil War and Reconstruction. And if we need some kind of third Reconstruction moment where we get some structural change, that's what we can do. So why would I be optimistic about this? Well, I mean, I also get the chance to see my students coming through every year, and there's just like a great crop of new faces every year, and I see them go out into the world, and I can't not believe they're going to change it in a positive way. So there's that. But then also, so like, look at American history. What I think you see is there are times where things look sort of placid and calm, and you might think, oh, American society is in a good place. But the absence of tension, the absence of conflict, is not necessarily a sign that things are okay. It might be a sign that there's a hierarchy, but it's pretty stable because the people in power have a good grip on power and dissent is suppressed. And so you just sort of don't see the injustice. And times when there are conflict, like now we've got a lot of conflict, times when there are conflict is often when we make the most progress. Because I sort of believe when you have a compromise and people are like, we're going to unify, when you have a compromise, that often favors inequality. I think you see this at lots of different moments in American history. But when you have conflict, I think the forces of equality tend to win. And you can look at like the Civil War, the run up to the Civil War. Compromise after compromise, they're all favoring slavery, right? Abolition is making progress in terms of changing people's minds, but it's not actually doing a whole lot on the ground. And if you look at like anti-slavery interpretations of the US Constitution, for instance, what does the Constitution mean right before the Civil War? According to the Supreme Court, it's Dred Scott. And Dred Scott is an attempt to solve the problem of slavery and produce unity through this terribly unjust interpretation of the Constitution. What brings us justice? What brings the end of slavery? The Civil War, right? It's the most costly war Americans have ever fought. It's the most Americans ever killed, and they're killed by other Americans. So terrible conflict, but that's when we get progress. So I do believe that when we have to make the choice, the American people choose justice. And I believe that if we have a conflict over that in the future and people have to pick a side, the forces of equality are going to win.
On to our next question. We have a question from Douglas. Excellent presentation. Have you read The Happy Hunting Grounds by your great grandfather? You have a striking resemblance to the picture of your great grandfather on the cover of the book. Are you a conservationist, similar to Theodore Roosevelt and his son, Kermit? If they were alive today, how would they feel about the current state of our environmental laws and stewardship?
Oh, well, thank you. I will take that as a compliment. I have read The Happy Hunting Grounds. I'm not sure that I can think of what the picture looks like. I'm not sure who I resemble. People sometimes say that. I don't know. But in terms of environmentalism, yes, I'm like a very big environmentalist. I think climate change is like the big issue that we're going to have to deal with. I think we've been doing a bad job of that. I mean, if there's one thing that I'm not optimistic about, honestly, it's sort of humanity's ability to act collectively to face a threat like that. I think, history just shows we're doing a terrible job. The urgency is going to become more apparent, and I hope that we're going to rise to the occasion. But in terms of what Theodore Roosevelt would think, so the national parks are maybe Theodore Roosevelt's greatest contribution to America. It's hard to pick just one, but the national parks are an amazing system. They've been called America's best idea, I think, and the extent to which like recent presidential administrations have de-protected and opened up to commercial exploitation areas that had been set off as national parks, I think is disappointing. So what do I think about the path forward? I mean, I think that the fragility of the natural world is becoming more apparent, and that should inspire people to protect it. But fragility is maybe a bad way of putting it, because it makes it sound as though there's this delicate, beautiful thing, the natural world and the environment, and maybe we'll destroy it and then we won't have it anymore, and that will be sad and it won't be as pretty and we can't see wild animals in all their glory. But that's really not the way it's going to happen. If we do serious damage to the global environment, it's not going to be that you can't go snorkel the Great Barrier Reef and see all the pretty fish. It's going to be that millions and hundreds of millions of people suffer seriously. So like, this is coming for us in a really serious way, I think. And we've got to take it more seriously than we do.
Would absolutely agree. So I think we have time for this one more question. This question comes from Robert. Thank you, Professor. Fascinating and provocative thoughts. What reactions/feedback are you getting to your book and ideas?
Oh, well, thanks. So it's interesting. Every time I give a talk, basically, there are a couple of people who say, wow, it really sort of makes sense. And I hadn't thought about it this way, but what you've said explains a lot about American history. And, the idea that the Revolution is a war fought by these states that recognize slavery. And the war that's against slavery is really the Civil War. Gosh, that sort of makes sense to me. And like Reconstruction is when the value of equality enters the Constitution. Yeah, now a lot of things sort of fit together in a new way. And of course, that's the reaction that I like, because that's sort of the process that I went through writing the book, where I was like, a lot of things in the standard story that we tell don't make that much sense, right? I mean, if all men are created equal is really anti-slavery, why is there in the Declaration this complaint about King George encouraging rebellions by enslaved people? How does that fit together? And why did we end up with a constitution that protects slavery and so on? So one reaction is, hey, like this sort of irons out some of the incongruities in the story that we tell ourselves. And that's good. And I like that. The other response that I get is, you hate America, you're a traitor. Which I think is interesting, because I want to say in response, why? What is it about 1776 that you love so much? Because here I am, and I'm saying I love America, right? I'm showing you a better America than the standard story does. I'm going to help you be more patriotic because you don't have to identify with Thomas Jefferson, who enslaved his own children. You can identify with Abraham Lincoln. You can identify with Benjamin Banneker, right? You can identify with abolitionists rather than people who preserved slavery. So this is something that I haven't quite figured out. Right? Why is it that some people are really so attached to the founding? And honestly, sometimes I think it has something to do with the fact that the founding was an era of white supremacy when there just wasn't this same kind of ideal of equality across racial lines. There wasn't this idea of equality for women in the same way. Now, Reconstruction is bad too on women, I have to admit that. But I would say, overall, I'm mostly pretty happy with the response I've been getting.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. It sounds like a wonderful book. So thank you again, Professor, for joining us today, and for sharing your narrative and your new way of looking at our standard story about our country. And I'd like to thank everyone else who has joined us today.
But I had a great time here today. Thank you so much for hosting us. And I think this was a really beneficial conversation that we had.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
Thanks so much for being here, Natasha. Always good to see you.
We hope you enjoyed your time with us here. And please, we look forward to you joining us at our next one. Thanks again, and good day.
Thank you.